Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Benjamin Gedan. Benjamin is the acting director of the center's Latin American program and the founding director of the Argentina Project. He joins us today from Buenos Aires. Welcome, Benjamin. Good to see you.
Lovely to be here. Thank you, John.
And we're going to be talking today about U.S. Latin American policy and the latest developments and what we might expect moving forward. And so speaking of the latest developments, Benjamin, let's begin with a bit of a review of Secretary Blinken's trip to several countries in the region. What was that all about? Where did he visit? And did it move the needle in any measurable way?
I think the impetus for the trip was to attend the General Assembly of the Organization of American States. It was meeting in Peru. And so the secretary took advantage of that opportunity and visited 3 countries in South America: Chile, Colombia, and Peru.
So a piece in Foreign Policy that you may have read by Christopher Sabatini essentially says that the U.S. has no authority in the region anymore. Here's a couple of specific things he wrote. Once dominant in the Western Hemisphere, Washington is finding itself in an unexpectedly weak partner, seeking to woo other countries rather than the other way around. Here's another thing he says. Many of these countries share domestic challenges similar to those of the United States, including inequality, migration, but it's unclear whether the U.S. will use this opportunity to develop meaningful and modern cooperation with Latin America, or whether it will continue to content itself with poorly attended summits, occasional high-level visits, and largely impotent sanctions. Pretty harsh commentary. I'd like to see what your thoughts are in this regard.
Yeah, it's harsh commentary, but it's a chronic lament right now for virtually anyone watching U.S. policy in regions like Latin America. And this is not exclusively a phenomenon in the Western Hemisphere. But I do think it's a prime example of the loss of influence, the loss of stature that the United States has suffered for a variety of reasons. I think Christopher's column points to some of them. These are issues that are domestic in terms of the model the United States once presented to the world, the quality of its own democracy, but also its inability in regions like Latin America to compete with other actors who have come in and provided a lot of assistance, a lot of investment, a market for the exports of major Latin American commodity producers that has diminished the importance of partnership with the United States.
Is the other actors list headed by China?
It is indeed. It really begins and ends with China, particularly in Latin America. Projects such as the famous Belt and Road Initiative, the enormous market that China represents for exports of commodities such as copper and lithium, beef and wheat and soy, have made China this principal character in the dramas of Latin America. And it has been difficult for the United States to adapt.
And so it sounds as if complacency is part of the issue here. The U.S. It just doesn't fully accept the fact that it has this global competitor eating its own lunch in its own hemisphere.
I wouldn't say that. That was a problem maybe 10 years ago. Now the problem is the United States seems to have accepted the challenge, but not come up with a solution.
Well, in that regard, often when I was thinking about how we frame this as U.S. Latin American policy, first of all, talking about a diverse region and having one policy that fits all sizes is probably unrealistic. It sort of brings up notions of grand strategy and whether we've ever had one that is fully effective, whether it's even possible given the complexities. What would be your analysis of the U.S. foreign policy as it relates to the hemisphere?
Yeah, I think the first thing I'd acknowledge is the obstacles to having a grand strategy in the hemisphere. One of the reasons is I think what you're alluding to, John, which is the enormous diversity within the hemisphere: economic, ideological, historical, and that does make it difficult. There's lack of consensus within the region, so it's difficult to interact with the region as a whole when there's so much disagreement within Latin America and a real failure of the multilateral infrastructure to bridge this divide and to create consensus within Latin America. And then there is, mixed quality of leadership in Latin America. And so it isn't always easy for the United States to find quality partners in the region. These are not excuses for the failures of US policy, but I do think that it's a very difficult task for this administration to try to improve and strengthen our standing in Latin America. On the other hand, I think it's critical that we do have a strategy and that we implement it with sufficient resources. And there, I think it's obvious we're falling short.
So we don't have a strategy. Is that what you just said?
I think we see the importance of Latin America. We recognize the level of competition that China represents. We're simply not putting in the attention and resources that the region demands.
And what is the obstacle to that? Is it our own domestic politics? Is it a lack of understanding of the region? What are the barriers to us to formulate this policy in a much more current and effective manner?
Yeah, it's disappointing, befuddling, but a chronic problem for Latin American policymakers focused on Latin America. When a big issue occurs elsewhere in the world, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, justifiably, we marshal enormous resources to address it. Latin America just has never demanded that level of attention and that level of US investment, despite competition from China, despite enormous cultural, historical, and economic ties, despite the urgent needs of the region and the impacts on the United States when there's instability in Latin America.
So did the Summit of the Americas back in June in Los Angeles achieve anything?
The opposite. I think, unfortunately, it was a demonstration of US impotence when it comes to policy in the hemisphere. The United States ended up begging foreign leaders to attend, successfully in some cases, unsuccessfully in others. And I think squandered a moment when everyone in the region thought, okay, if the United States is serious about Latin America, here's the moment when it will put serious alternatives and resources on the table to reduce the dependency on China and address pressing needs.
Is it useful to talk about, well, we already discussed that it's not useful to talk about a blanket approach. So I'm wondering, what would be the approach? Is it simply country by country by country by country, or is there some sort of way to coalesce a regional strategy?
Look, in an ideal world, the United States would give every country on earth the attention that it merits and have an approach that's unique to the needs and the desires of those countries. It's not feasible, okay? There's limited bandwidth. And so treating Latin America as a unit is helpful, I think, to making sure that the United States is strategic and can provide at least a minimal level of attention and investment. I think the answer is finding opportunity in the region and finding ways to be cohesive in addressing the problems in the region as well. I'll give a few examples, John. You know, the nearshoring and friendshoring that you and I have discussed in the past remains, I think, a useful paradigm for seeing Latin America. It's an area of opportunity for the United States to move manufacturing from places that are either authoritarian or geographically inconvenient into places that are democratic, share US values, are geographically convenient, in some cases have free trade agreements with the United States. This is one of many examples of how we could gain a lot from the relationship in Latin America.
Would that mean that the operative term here would be partnerships? That would be the most useful role for the US, to find like-minded partners to work on the issues or the situations where common ground is shared.
I think that's true. And I think the Biden administration is committed to that, despite all the obstacles I mentioned. And I didn't even mention one of the biggest, which is the ideological shift in the region from conservative governments that have historically been more pro-US to governments on the left and center left that may come in with a bit more skepticism about the relationship with the United States. I do think the paradigm has to be finding opportunity. We can't be naive, however. I think there are leaders in the region with whom it's very difficult to have a good relationship. They're not supportive of human rights and democracy. In fact, quite the opposite. They've been repressing dissent, canceling elections, exiling independent judges and prosecutors. So I do think it has to be a mix, while recognizing in all cases that there's a lot to gain from good relations in Latin America and stability, and importantly, a lot to lose from a region that is suffering the way it is right now.
I want to dig a little deeper on this whole ideology question that you bring up. Give us some specifics. What are the countries that are still most closely aligned with the US, and where are their cracks starting to show in the relationship?
Look, there's plenty of distance these days between the United States and many leaders in Latin America, and we've already discussed the diminishing US influence in the region. I think the most important point, however, is not to use the ideology of a leader as shorthand for his or her relationship with the United States. And I do think this government in the United States right now is doing a good job of not drawing those lines. The only example I need to point to is the itinerary of Secretary Blinken's trip. 3 countries, Peru, Colombia, and Chile, all governed by leaders on the left and center left, and all chosen by the Secretary of State as the destinations for this important South America trip. It's a showing of the United States' openness to close relations with governments of all ideological stripes, provided they're respectful of democratic norms and interested in a positive relationship with the White House.
What does the US relationship with Cuba, or lack thereof, tell us about this thing that we're talking about now, where the US seems to be out of step with most of the region and maybe even most of the world in relation to its policy toward Cuba?
Look, Latin American governments were overjoyed when the Obama administration attempted a rapprochement with Cuba, trying to see if there could be, through greater contact, greater economic and maybe eventually political openings. Obviously, that was reversed under the last US administration, and there haven't been profound changes under the Biden administration, despite some expectations that there would have been a renewal of contacts of the type we saw in the Obama era. Is that really significant throughout Latin America? I'm not sure. I mean, I think rhetorically you will hear criticism of it, but I think the bigger issue is the United States as seen as not showing up. The United States not seen as putting the resources that would match the promises to the region and the acknowledgement, again, in rhetoric only, that this is a region that's of strategic importance to the United States.
I'll do a little cross promotion here, Benjamin, and mention that you and I are also part of the America's 360 podcast. And often I joke with you, but I actually, it bears out if people listen to the program, that you often are the optimists among our panelists when we're talking about these issues, because you identify opportunities or potential movement that may not be apparent if you're just following headlines. In the regard to U.S. policy in Latin America, put on your optimist hat. Where do you see the biggest opportunities, and where do you see some movement in the near future?
I never take it off, John. It's been there all along.
It fits so well. You should do it.
No, look, I think the fact that the administration is working hard to maintain and strengthen relations, no matter who wins election in the region, is a source of optimism for me. I think there's lots of voices in Washington who are reflexively anxious whenever someone from the left is elected and content to sit out for 4 years until there's another opportunity to have a conservative in power. I think correctly, that is not the approach of the Biden administration. I think the presence of nearshoring, friendshoring opportunities, this idea of moving manufacturing to the region, getting critical minerals like copper and lithium from the region is a reason for enormous optimism. I think the fact that leaders like Gabriel Boric of Chile, who met with Secretary of State Blinken, the commitment to human rights, the commitment to a good relationship with the United States, the defense of democracy, all reasons for optimism. I think the region needs more presence from the United States. It needs more investment from the United States. It needs more visits like the one we just saw by Secretary Blinken. But I do think there's enormous opportunity to address the problems that are causing migration, that are causing democratic decline, but also to take advantage of opportunities for the United States.
You mentioned some of the leaders in the region, and we've been looking at this from the northern perspective, U.S. looking south. What about looking north? Who are the leaders in the region who could play a major role in changing the equation between either their country or their neighbors and the whole region and the United States?
I think it's an important question. You mentioned that I'm in Buenos Aires at this moment, and often when I speak to leaders in the region, whether in Congress or civil society and presidential palaces, there's often a question about U.S. policy toward Latin America. And I like to ask the opposite question. What is the vision of a particular country, a subset of countries, this region, toward the United States? And I don't really hear a lot of cohesive answers from Latin America. You know, before the Summit of the Americas, there was a lot of criticism about whom the United States was or was not inviting, but not a lot about what agenda the United States should have been putting forward. And I do think that that is not in the interest of Latin America. I think when the US speaks of partnership, it is open to hearing the vision from Latin America for how to build a more cohesive hemisphere. I think the reason, unfortunately, we don't hear that has to do with not only a lack of consensus in Latin America, though that contributes to it, but also very inward focused leadership throughout Latin America. The problems are so grave right now that it is very hard for leaders throughout the Americas to think grandly about big strategy and hemispheric policy.
Mm-hmm. We haven't mentioned specifically migration, and it hovers over any discussion of policy in the Western Hemisphere. How critical is this issue as far in terms of, if you solve this, is this the key to unlocking all kinds of other opportunities?
Unfortunately, it's more of a symptom of problems than the problem itself that needs solving. Although if you're monitoring the United States southwest border, it is a grave problem that does need solving. I think what it is the evidence of grave underlying problems of authoritarianism, problems of climate change impacts on agriculture, problems of human rights abuses, problems of stagnant economies, all manifesting themselves in these unprecedented flows of migrants, and not only to the United States, but within Latin America. You have, to me, one of the most symbolic parts of the migration crisis right now is in Panama, the border between Panama and Colombia. There's an area called the Darion Gap, this treacherous jungle with snakes, with criminals, with thieves, that was not a route for migrants ever before in any significant numbers. That's now seeing, tens of thousands of people traveling through, largely from Venezuela. Venezuela, but from other points in the region, that I think right now just shows the level of desperation.
Would it be safe to say, for me to guess, that if you were looking at a U.S. foreign policy agenda ranked by priorities, that Latin America isn't as high as it ought to be?
Yes, I think that's true today, and that's always been true.
And then with that in mind, where should it sit in the list of priorities?
It's hard to imagine a prosperous, safe, secure United States without a prosperous, safe, secure Latin America. I think that's fundamentally true. Lots of foreign policy thinkers have pointed out that the US has interests everywhere, but cannot really dedicate the attention and resources needed elsewhere unless Latin America is prosperous and secure. I think migration is one of those issues, and it's why we frequently dedicate relatively more attention to Central America, for example, and Southern Mexico, and sometimes the Caribbean than South America, for example. But I do think for the United States to be prosperous, to be secure, to be safe, and to have the bandwidth to address problems much further away from its borders, Latin America needs to be addressed with better attention and resources.
One final thought, Benjamin, is what markers are you going to be looking at? You know, we're always looking ahead to what might change the calculus, whether it's the outcome of the election in Brazil. What are the things that Latin American followers are watching now that are coming in the next couple of weeks or months?
Yeah, I would say two things. One is, will the United States finally marshal serious resources to put in Latin America? You've had a couple of announcements from the White House and from the G7 group of industrialized countries about competing with the Belt and Road Initiative and offering billions of dollars in infrastructure finance. Will any of that materialize and come to Latin America to increase US influence in the region and to address some of the chronic underdevelopment? That'd be number one from the US perspective. From the region, it would be what will happen in the Brazilian election and what will happen with US-Colombia relations. One of the presidents that Secretary of State Blinken met with is Gustavo Petro, who's a president who could go in pretty drastically different directions when it comes to US-Colombia relations. He has very different views than many of his predecessors about the relationship with the United States economically, drug policy, energy policy. On the other hand, there's areas of agreement, including on the environment. So things can move in really radically different directions. Also, Colombia policy toward Venezuela will condition Colombia's relationship with the United States. And it's a very critical strategic relationship. So I would say those are probably the two biggest unknowns right now that will condition how the United States maneuvers itself in this very difficult hemisphere.
Well, Benjamin, as always, thank you for a fantastic briefing. And to our viewers who are tracking these issues, a good place to start is wilsoncenter.org, the Latin American program. The work that Benjamin and his team does is fantastic, and it's a way to keep on top of all of these issues and more. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thanks, John. And thanks for allowing me to wear the hat. I know this is a formal platform, but can't take it.
When it comes out, when I need an optimism boost, you're my guy.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.